Okay, so this is Chapter 7, Part 2. Greta is absent from this video, so it won't be as exciting. I apologize for that. So I mentioned that the providing the framework for your body is the number one function, or one of the main functions of bone, but there's also other functions. Supporting and protecting movement, hemopoiesis, which is very important, and storage of mineral and energy reserves. So let's get into those. So the structural support, a framework. So our muscles, our skeletal muscles work with our bones to create movement. We have muscles that attach to all different parts of all your bones that allow movement to happen. Also, these bones protect organs, which you're probably well aware of, that the rib cage made up of your ribs and your sternum and your spine protects your heart and your lungs. Your cranial bones protect your brain. Your vertebrae protect your spinal cord. And in your pelvis, you have the internal reproductive organs, the end of your digestive system, and your urinary system in there. So, movement, like I said, attachment site for muscles, also soft tissues are connected to your bones and some organs. And also, there's a system of levers. So your joints create levers in the body that allow the muscles to pull on the skeleton, creating the movement. Hemopoiesis is the process of blood cell formation. This is a word, heme. That prefix is going to come up a lot, especially when we talk about the blood. So blood cell production is hemopoiesis. And why do we talk about red blood cell or blood cell production in the bones? Because the red bone marrow that's in your bones is where it happens. You have stem cells in your red bone marrow that are capable of becoming blood cells and platelets. So we're talking red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which are involved in blood clotting. So another purpose of the bone tissue is to store mineral and energy reserves. So two important inorganic substances that are stored in bone, calcium and phosphate. Calcium is needed for proper muscle contraction, so the ability of your muscles to produce work relies on calcium. The ability of your nervous system, the nerves to send messages, is critical that calcium is there. Also, blood clotting. Phosphate is important for making energy, ATP utilization, that's energy. And phospholipid bilayer, remember that? It's a component of your cell plasma membrane. Also, fat or lipids are stored in yellow bone marrow of adult. There are 4 different types of bone by shape. So we talked about the 2 general types of bones. We got spongy and compact, and then we have 4 different shapes to bones. Long bones are greater in length than they are in width. The most common bone shape, they have an elongated shaft region. That's the part you grab onto. You're going to find it in your upper and lower limbs, and they vary in size. Short bones are about as long as they are wide. So we don't find these a lot of places, but in your wrists, your carpals, in your tarsals, your foot bones, and I guess this book categorizes your patella or your kneecap in that category as well. It's kind of an odd one. Flat bones are just how they sound. They are very, very thin. They might be curved. They're mainly provide a surface for muscle attachment, and they're going to protect underlying tissues, like think of your skull bones, your scapula, back here, your sternum, and your ribs are all flat bones. Irregular bones are some bones that don't fit into any one of those other 3 categories, and they're very elaborate, different complex shapes. Your vertebrae are a good example, your coxa, hip bones, and then many bones in your skull. Skull has some cool looking bones. And then here's a great picture showing the 4 different types of bones and examples of where we can find them. The detailed anatomy or the gross anatomy of bones, we'll talk about long bones specifically. So think of a long bone like a femur or a humerus or your radius or your ulna, any of those. They have a diaphysis, or the elongated middle portion. It's compact bone on the outside with the little spicules of spongy bone on the inside. You saw this in the lab with parts of the cow forearm bone. I don't know which one it was. They didn't tell me, but it was probably a radius or an ulna. The medullary cavity is the middle section of a long bone that's very hollow. Um, it's cylindrical and it contains in children red bone marrow, but as we age, that red bone marrow turns to yellow bone marrow. And that's why you could tell that it was a greasy, fatty substance in the middle of the bone there. At the ends of the long bone, at the ephyses, they're called, you're going to have a proximal ephysis and a distal ephysis, named appropriately so. Proximal closer to the point of attachment, distal further away. We have an outer thin layer, and we have a lot of spongy bone in the ephyses. And on the ends of the ephyses, so we have the ends of the bones, we're going to have a thin layer of what's called articular cartilage. It's a type of, or a specific name of hyaline cartilage, is there to prevent friction when bones move across the surface of other bones. It also is going to absorb some shock. In between the diaphysis, the shaft, and the ephyses, we have a little portion that doesn't really fit into the others. It's called the metaphysis. And then in that area, the metaphysis, we have the ephyseal plate. And this is very important for lengthwise growth. This is where the growth plate is located, the ephyseal plate. And it's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage with 5 distinctive zones. And it's going to make us our height, our lengthwise height. I'm 5'10". When I was in 6th grade, I was 5'2". In my ephyseal plate, I still had cartilage cells there, and as I grew, they became calcified. When you've reached your maximum vertical height, you no longer have cartilage cells. There's something called an ephyseal line, is the remnants of that growth plate where it used to be. Again, there's many good pictures of a long bone and the parts. Make sure you take a look at them. Continuing, this is a long bone continuing. On the outside, you have this layer. It's called the periosteum. It's a very tough tissue on the outside of bone, and it's composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. Hopefully, you were able to see how it peels off the bone. It's going to protect it. It's going to anchor blood vessels and nerves to the bones. It's going to be an important attachment site for ligaments and tendons. And there's a layer inside that periosteum that has bone cells, osteoprogenitor cells. These are like the stem cells, osteoblasts, which build bone tissue, and osteoclasts, which carve out bone tissue. And it's attached to the bone underneath by these little collagen fibers that have a specific name called perforating fibers. So here's the periosteum being peeled off here. Here's our compact bone. And we see these little collagen fibers perforating. The cellular layer that contains osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitor cells. We'll talk about all 3 of those. And then this is the actual compact bone. Okay, so you can peel that off. Inside of the bone, so lining the medullary cavity, we have the endostenum. It also contains osteoprogenitor cells, like the stem cells of bone cells, osteoblasts, which builds bone, and osteoclasts, which carve out bone. And this is the endostenum. We see these osteoclasts, blasts, and osteoprogenitor cells. This is the endostenum, this lining right here. And here's the spongy bone. So continuing on, flat bones, short bones, and irregular bones differ from long bones in their gross anatomy. They have the compact bone on the outside, and they have a lot more spongy bone on the inside, and they don't have a medullary cavity. So we won't really talk about the gross anatomy of a flat bone, but here it is, the compact bone with spongy bone in the middle. No cavity, no ephyses, all of that. Bones are well supplied with blood. It's highly vascularized, okay, especially in the areas of spongy bone because it has a red bone marrow. How the vessels get into the bone is through the periosteum and through these holes in the bone. When you see the word foramen, that means hole in the bone. In this case, it's called a nutrient foramen, small openings, and hopefully you were able to see those in the cow bones that bring in the arteries, the blood, the veins, and then also nerves. So nerves and blood get in through those holes, and they're going to innervate the nerves, the periosteum, the endosteum in the middle of the bone. So it hurts when you break a bone. Bone marrow, we talked about the two types, right? So let's talk a little bit more. There's red and there's yellow. Red bone marrow is hemopoietic, so it forms blood cells. It contains also reticular connective tissue, immature blood cells, and fat. In children, there's more red bone marrow. Like, for example, in the medullary cavity that I said contains yellow bone marrow, but in children, it contains red bone marrow. So the children have a higher capacity to produce blood cells. In adults, we only see it in selected areas. When I talk about bone marrow transplants, these are the areas that I'm referring to because they're not going to harvest red bone marrow from a child unless they absolutely have to. A skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, sternum, your coxa, your hip, and then the epiphyses of your humerus and your femur. And I said the most common type or way to get it is through the hip and the sternum because they're the closest to the surface. So as you age, that red bone marrow becomes yellow bone marrow, and yellow bone marrow is fatty, contains fat. But cool thing is if you're severely anemic or you lack enough red blood cells, that yellow bone marrow can convert back to red bone marrow. So you have the ability to produce more blood cells. And this just shows in the adult skeleton where the red bone marrow is highly condensed, right in the middle of the body and on the skull. And I talked about the bone marrow transplant before, why somebody might need it. Maybe they have undergone radiation chemo that destroys actively growing cells like red blood cells, or maybe their bone marrow is producing cells that are abnormal, and so they harvest it from a donor, and that donor needs to be a very good match, not only blood type wise, but immune system wise, for them to harvest the bone marrow and put it into that person's bloodstream. And then it will migrate to the appropriate places, thus replacing the blood cells. Make sure you go over what these questions and what did you learn. I'm not going to take the time to go over them right now, but make sure you can answer all of those questions. It's very important for the overall understanding of what we talk about. And that is the end of part 2.